What if I told you that there was once a single day when the most feared air force in the world realized they were finished, not by a massive attack, not by overwhelming numbers, but by the sight of one American fighter aircraft appearing where it was simply impossible for it to exist? This is not a tale of dramatic air battles or spectacular dogfights, though those came later. This is the story of the exact moment when German air superiority died, not with the roar of engines or the thunder of guns, but with the quiet disbelief of experienced pilots who suddenly understood they were witnessing the impossible. On March 6, 1944, over the burning skies of Berlin, German fighter pilots experienced something that would fundamentally alter the course of the Second World War. They saw American P-51 Mustangs, sleek silver fighters that had flown all the way from England, engaged in 30 minutes of brutal air combat and still had enough fuel to fly home. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. For the first time in the war, the Luftwaffe realized they faced not just another fighter aircraft, but a weapon that could reach anywhere in the Reich and return safely to England. This is the story of how a single aircraft transformed aerial warfare, shattered German morale, and ultimately decided the fate of World War II. It's the story of the day when Hermann Göring, looking up at silver Mustangs over his capital city, whispered the words that would echo through history: "I knew the jig was up." The North American P-51 Mustang began life as an afterthought, almost a consolation prize. In April 1940, as German Messerschmitts were tearing through European skies and Britain faced the prospect of fighting alone, the British Purchasing Commission approached North American Aviation with a desperate request: build more Curtiss P-40 Warhawks under license. The British needed fighters, and they needed them fast. But James Kindleberger, North American's chief designer, had a different idea. Instead of building someone else's outdated design, he proposed something audacious: design and build a completely new fighter from scratch in just 117 days. The British, facing extinction, agreed to what seemed like an impossible gamble. What emerged was revolutionary: an aircraft with a laminar flow wing that cut through the air like a knife, powered initially by an Allison engine that made it fast at low altitudes, but limited at the high altitudes where the air war over Europe was being fought. The early Mustangs were good, but they weren't the game changer that would come later. It took a marriage of American airframe design with British engine technology to create the weapon that would break the Luftwaffe's back. The transformation came when British engineers fitted captured Mustangs with Rolls-Royce Merlin engines, the same power plants that had saved Britain during the Battle of Britain. The results were staggering. Where the Allison-powered Mustang could barely reach 390 mph at 20,000 feet, the Merlin-powered version screamed through the sky at over 440 mph at 30,000 feet. More importantly, it could carry enough fuel to fly from England to Berlin and back, something no other Allied fighter could do. The story of how the P-51 came to appear over Berlin begins with a crisis that nearly lost the war for the Allies. By late 1943, the American daylight bombing campaign against Germany was failing catastrophically. B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators were being slaughtered by German fighters. The mission to Schweinfurt on October 14, 1943, Black Thursday, saw 60 bombers shot down and 138 damaged out of 291 that had set out. The losses were unsustainable. The problem was simple: existing Allied fighters couldn't escort the bombers all the way to their targets. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt was a formidable fighter, but its range topped out at about 475 miles. The Lockheed P-38 Lightning had better range, but it was complicated, expensive, and struggled in the cold, high-altitude conditions over Germany. German pilots had learned to simply wait until the Allied escorts reached the limit of their range and turned back, then pounce on the undefended bombers. What the Allies needed was a fighter that could accompany the bombers to Berlin and back, a round trip of over 1,100 miles. Most aviation experts believed such an aircraft was impossible. The fuel requirements alone seemed prohibitive, and any fighter carrying that much fuel would be too heavy and sluggish to fight effectively against the nimble German interceptors. But beneath the crisis lay the seeds of an extraordinary transformation. In scattered hangars across Britain, American mechanics and British engineers were working on what would become one of history's most successful military collaborations. The breakthrough came when test pilot Ronald Hawker took a Merlin-powered Mustang prototype into the English sky in October 1942. What he discovered changed everything. The aircraft didn't just perform better at high altitude, it performed spectacularly, reaching speeds that seemed almost impossible for a single-engine fighter. The early combat experiences of P-51 pilots revealed both the aircraft's potential and its growing pains. Lieutenant Colonel James Howard, flying escort missions in early 1944, found himself separated from his squadron during a bomber escort mission to Oschersleben. Instead of withdrawing to safety, Howard made a decision that would define the Mustang's reputation. He attacked over 30 German fighters single-handedly, engaging in a running battle that lasted 30 minutes. His actions that day earned him the Medal of Honor, but more importantly, they demonstrated to both friend and foe that the P-51 was not just another fighter. It was a weapon capable of changing the fundamental mathematics of air warfare. The German reaction to these early encounters reveals the psychological impact of facing an enemy where none should exist. Luftwaffe pilots, accustomed to the comfortable knowledge that deep penetration missions left Allied fighters at the edge of their fuel reserves, suddenly found themselves confronting fresh, aggressive American pilots hundreds of miles inside the Reich. The tactical handbooks that had served German fighter squadrons well since 1940 were suddenly obsolete. General Adolf Galland, one of Germany's most experienced fighter commanders, later described the moment when the Luftwaffe High Command finally accepted the reality of the P-51's capabilities. Official reports claiming that no long-range Allied fighters were operating over Germany continued even as Galland and his pilots encountered Mustangs daily. The disconnect between political necessity and battlefield reality reached absurd proportions when Galland himself climbed into a Focke-Wulf 190 to personally investigate reports of American fighters over Berlin. The Mustangs found him first. His wingman was shot down, and Galland escaped only by firing his guns forward, creating enough smoke and debris to convince the pursuing Americans that they were being attacked from behind. The transformation of the P-51 from a good low-altitude fighter into the war-winning escort fighter of 1944 represented one of the most successful engineering collaborations in military history. American aerodynamics met British power plant technology, creating something neither nation could have achieved alone. The Packard-built Merlin engine gave the Mustang not just speed and altitude performance, but also the fuel efficiency needed for those crucial long-range missions. But technology alone could not account for the P-51's devastating effectiveness. The aircraft demanded new tactics, new training methods, and new ways of thinking about air combat. American pilot training programs evolved rapidly to meet these challenges, developing techniques that maximized the Mustang's advantages while compensating for its vulnerabilities. The result was a generation of pilots who thought differently about distance, endurance, and the very nature of fighter combat in ways that their enemies found almost impossible to counter. The arrival of the long-range P-51 Mustang fundamentally challenged every assumption about air warfare that had dominated military thinking since World War I began. For decades, the accepted wisdom held that fighters were inherently short-range defensive weapons, suitable for intercepting bombers near their home bases, but incapable of the endurance needed for deep penetration missions. The Mustang shattered this paradigm entirely. The psychological warfare aspect of the P-51's capabilities proved as important as its technical specifications. German pilots had grown accustomed to a certain rhythm of air combat over their homeland. Allied escorts would appear at the edge of German airspace, engage briefly, then turn back as their fuel ran low. The bombers would continue deeper into Germany, increasingly vulnerable and isolated, until German fighters could attack them with relative impunity on the return journey. This predictable pattern allowed the Luftwaffe to husband their resources and strike when the odds were most favorable. The Mustang destroyed this comfortable tactical equation overnight. German pilots suddenly found themselves facing American fighters not just at the border of the Reich, but over Berlin itself, over Munich, over the deepest targets in German territory. More shocking still, these weren't desperate, fuel-starved pilots limping home on fumes. They were fresh, aggressive, and capable of sustained combat deep in the heart of Germany. The range revolution that the P-51 represented went beyond mere numbers on a fuel gauge. It meant that nowhere in German-controlled territory was safe from Allied air attack. Training bases that had operated with impunity in eastern Germany suddenly found themselves under assault. Aircraft factories in Bavaria came under fighter attack. The psychological security of depth, the belief that the German homeland's interior was inviolate, evaporated in the face of silver Mustangs appearing where no enemy fighter had ever flown before. This shift in the possible geography of air combat forced Germany to completely restructure their air defense strategy. Resources had to be dispersed rather than concentrated. Experienced pilots could no longer be safely withdrawn to rear areas for rest and training. The entire Luftwaffe organization, built around the assumption of strategic depth and sanctuary, had to adapt to a new reality where American fighters could appear anywhere, at any time. The P-51's solution to the range problem was elegant in its simplicity and revolutionary in its implementation. External drop tanks, combined with internal fuel efficiency improvements, gave the Mustang an unprecedented operational radius. But the true genius lay not just in the fuel capacity, but in how that fuel was managed and used tactically. The Mustang pilots developed new combat techniques that maximized their aircraft's advantages while compensating for its vulnerabilities. The liquid-cooled Merlin engine, while powerful and efficient, was more vulnerable to battle damage than the air-cooled radial engines of aircraft like the P-47 Thunderbolt. A single well-placed cannon shell could pierce the cooling system and force a pilot to abandon his aircraft hundreds of miles from home. This vulnerability forced Mustang pilots to develop new tactical approaches that emphasized speed, surprise, and the aircraft's superior diving characteristics. The implementation of what became known as fighter sweeps represented another tactical innovation enabled by the P-51's range. Instead of simply escorting bombers defensively, Mustang formations began hunting German fighters proactively, seeking out Luftwaffe bases and attacking German pilots in training. These missions struck at the root of German air power by targeting not just aircraft, but the irreplaceable experienced pilots who flew them. Perhaps most importantly, the P-51 enabled a fundamental shift in Allied strategic thinking. The bomber will always get through doctrine that had dominated pre-war aviation theory had proven tragically inadequate against determined fighter opposition. The Mustang allowed the Allies to combine the strategic reach of heavy bombers with the tactical flexibility of fighter aircraft, creating a new form of warfare that maximized the advantages of both while minimizing their individual weaknesses. The training programs developed for P-51 pilots reflected this new tactical reality. Clobber colleges were established to teach American pilots not just how to fly the Mustang, but how to fight effectively at extreme range, how to manage fuel consumption during extended combat, and how to navigate back to England after hours of high-intensity aerial combat deep inside enemy territory. The moral complexity of the P-51's impact on the air war reveals uncomfortable truths about the nature of technological superiority in warfare. The Mustang's ability to attack German training bases meant that Allied pilots were frequently engaging student pilots, young men barely out of their teens with minimal flying experience. These clay pigeons, as American pilots sometimes called them, represented both a strategic necessity and an ethical challenge that many veterans would grapple with for decades after the war. The testimony of German prisoners of war provides a sobering perspective on the Mustang's effectiveness. Captured Luftwaffe pilots consistently rated the P-51 as the most dangerous Allied fighter they faced, not necessarily because it was superior in all aspects of performance, but because it could appear anywhere and engage in sustained combat. German ace Kurt Bühligen, who achieved 112 victories on the Western Front, acknowledged that while German fighters could outturn the Mustang in close combat, the American aircraft's speed and range advantages made it nearly impossible to counter effectively. The personal accounts from German pilots who survived encounters with P-51s reveal a psychological dimension to the air war that statistics alone cannot capture. Obergefreiter Walter Wolfram, a veteran Messerschmitt pilot, later described his experience flying a captured P-51 after the war. Despite acknowledging the Mustang's superior capabilities, he found the aircraft's complexity disturbing. The American cockpit, with its array of controls and switches, seemed almost overwhelming compared to the simpler German designs he was accustomed to. This reaction highlights a fundamental difference in design philosophy. German aircraft prioritized simplicity and ease of production, while American designs embraced complexity in pursuit of maximum performance and capability. The strategic bombing debate that continues among historians today cannot ignore the role the P-51 played in making daylight precision bombing feasible. Without the Mustang's escort capability, the American bombing campaign would likely have been forced to adopt British night bombing tactics, with all the attendant collateral damage and reduced accuracy that entailed. The P-51, paradoxically, may have made the bombing war both more effective and more humane by enabling precision attacks that would have been impossible without fighter escort. Yet the human cost of this technological advantage cannot be overlooked. By 1944, the Luftwaffe was increasingly manned by inexperienced pilots, many with fewer than 20 hours of flight training. The systematic destruction of German training facilities by long-range P-51 missions created a vicious cycle. As experienced pilots were lost, replacements arrived with inadequate preparation, making them even more vulnerable to the experienced American pilots who had been honing their skills in combat for months or years. The aircraft's impact on the development of air power doctrine extended far beyond World War II. The concept of deep strike fighters, capable of projecting power across vast distances while maintaining combat effectiveness, became a cornerstone of Cold War aviation development. From the F-86 Sabre in Korea to modern multi-role fighters, the influence of the P-51's operational concept can be traced through decades of subsequent aircraft development. The environmental cost of the P-51's success, though rarely discussed in wartime accounts, was significant. Each mission required hundreds of gallons of high-octane aviation fuel, a precious resource that required complex refinement processes and extensive supply chains. The logistical challenge of keeping P-51 units supplied with fuel, ammunition, and spare parts across the English Channel, and later from forward bases in France, represented a triumph of organizational capability that often goes unrecognized in popular accounts of the aircraft's success. Critics of the strategic bombing campaign often overlook the degree to which the P-51's success in achieving air superiority made possible the tactical air support that proved crucial during the Normandy invasion and subsequent ground campaigns. The sight of only 2 German aircraft appearing over the D-Day beaches, compared to the thousands that might have been expected earlier in the war, testified to the Mustang's role in clearing the skies for Operation Overlord. The psychological warfare aspects of the P-51's presence over Germany extended beyond its direct military impact. German civilians, who had been told that the Reich's air defenses were impregnable, could look up and see American fighters circling overhead with apparent impunity. This visible proof of Allied air superiority undermined home front morale in ways that bombing raids alone could not achieve, contributing to the growing sense that the war was lost long before German forces actually surrendered. On that March day in 1944, when Hermann Göring looked up and saw American Mustangs circling over the Reich Chancellery in Berlin, he was witnessing more than just another air raid. He was seeing the future of warfare itself, a future where distance provided no sanctuary, where technological superiority could override numerical advantage, and where the impossible could become not just possible, but inevitable. The German pilots who laughed at early reports of single-engine American fighters over Berlin soon learned that their laughter was premature. Many of those same pilots never made it home from their encounters with the Silver Angels that seemed to appear from nowhere and disappear into the blue European sky, only to return the next day and the day after that. The P-51 Mustang proved that in warfare, as in so many aspects of human endeavor, the game-changing innovations often come not from completely new concepts, but from the perfect combination of existing technologies applied in revolutionary ways. The marriage of American engineering, British engine technology, and operational necessity created something that was greater than the sum of its parts, an aircraft that didn't just change how wars were fought, but how they could be won. By the time the war ended, P-51 pilots had claimed nearly 5,000 enemy aircraft destroyed in air-to-air combat, more than any other Allied fighter, despite arriving relatively late to the conflict. But numbers alone cannot capture the psychological impact of an aircraft that appeared where it was supposed to be impossible, fought where no Allied fighter had fought before, and returned home to fight again the next day. The lesson of the P-51 Mustang echoes across the decades. In the crucible of mortal conflict, the advantage goes not always to the strongest or the most numerous, but to those who can be where their enemies believe they cannot be, when their enemies believe they cannot be there. On that day in March 1944, American ingenuity and determination, embodied in the sleek silver form of the P-51 Mustang, proved that impossible is just another word for what hasn't been done yet. The German pilots who survived their encounters with the Mustang carried with them a sobering truth. They had met their match not in a bigger, more powerful aircraft, but in one that simply refused to accept the limitations that had defined air combat since the Wright brothers first took to the skies. In challenging those limitations, the P-51 Mustang didn't just help win a war, it redefined what was possible in the realm of human flight and forever changed the face of aerial warfare.